Count them. Count the Primarchs. The Lion, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Jaghatai Khan, Leman Russ, Rogal Dorn, Konrad Curze, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Angron, Roboute Guilliman, Mortarion, Magnus, Horus, Lorgar, Vulkan, Corax, Alpharius. That is 18. There were 20, twice, at the 2nd and at the 11th. The official record gives you a number with nothing attached to it, a gap the exact shape of a sun. The Imperium will tell you those records were lost. They were not lost. They were cut. And here is the detail the censors could not fully erase. The Emperor built 20 Primarchs, and at least one of them was built to be the answer to a problem he had not yet created. A sorcerer's son named Magnus, whose power would one day crack the Imperium open. What do you build to stop a psyker that strong? You don't build a stronger psyker. You build the opposite. You build a void. You build a Primarch who is a hole in the warp itself, and then, when he works too well, you make him disappear.
That is the thesis. We are not here to re-argue whether the 2nd and the 11th existed. The plinths exist. The numbers exist. We are here to ask a narrower, stranger question. What was the 11th for? And why does the answer terrify the men who erased him more than any traitor ever could? Before we go a step further, one promise. We are not going to give him a name. The canon refuses to print one, and so do we. The moment a video hands you a name for the 11th, it has stopped reading the record and started writing fan fiction. Stay with the 11th. Stay with the 2nd. The gap is the evidence. Inventing a name only fills it in. Start with what the Imperium actually wrote down, because it is almost nothing, and the nothing is the point. According to Lexicanum's reconstruction of the canon, the records of the 2nd and 11th legions are noted in imperial listings with a single clerical word: expunged, destroyed. Nothing more. No homeworld.
No campaign honors that survived. No name carved anywhere the Inquisition could reach. Imperial historians do not call this an accident. They call it the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. Hold that phrase, because it does a great deal of work. An edict of obliteration, its older High Gothic name is Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory, is not a filing error. It is a procedure. It is the Inquisition deciding that a person, an event, an entire legion of genetically engineered demigods will be treated as though it never drew breath. Statues come down. Archives are scoured. Survivors are debriefed, and the debrief is sealed. The phrase the lore uses is precise. They are erased as if they had never existed. Now hold the two things side by side. The Imperium says the records were lost. The Imperium also says this was the most successful deliberate erasure in its history. Those are not the same claim. You do not accidentally run the most successful redaction in 10,000 years. The Lost Records line is the cover story printed on top of the cut. And we have a witness to the cut, a Primarch, in his own point of view, looking at the proof. Here is the 2nd name you need. And it is not the 11th. It is Rogal Dorn. In Dan Abnett's Horus Heresy short story, The Lightning Tower, Dorn walks the investiary of the Imperial Palace as he prepares Terra for siege. The investiary held 20 plinths, one for each Primarch, 20 statues of the Emperor's sons. And in Abnett's text, 2 of those plinths have stood empty for a very long time. The statues that belonged on them were destroyed when their owners were, in the story's own phrase, cast to oblivion and their history erased. Dorn knows.
A loyal Primarch, one of the Emperor's most trusted, stands in front of two empty stone bases and understands exactly what they mean. The architecture of the palace is itself a record.
The Imperium built 20 plinths and then unbuilt 2 of the statues, and it left the empty plinth standing. That is not forgetting. That is a scar the building was told to keep. So the erasure is real, it is deliberate, and a Primarch testifies to it. The question the whole rest of this hangs on is the one the Imperium will never print. Not how were they erased? Why? And to answer that, we have to talk about the one Primarch the Emperor could not control, because the 11th only makes sense as his shadow. Here is where the canon hands us a problem the size of a god, Magnus the Red. Across the lore he is described one consistent way, a psyker without peer, save only for the Emperor himself, the most powerful psyker in the galaxy after the man who made him. When the Emperor first found Magnus, the texts say he had found in his son the only being with more psychic potential than any other living thing, second only to himself. Sit with what that means structurally. The entire Imperium is held together by psychic infrastructure.
The Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon screaming out of Terra, is the lighthouse without which no warp ship can navigate, without which the Imperium is 10,000 isolated worlds in the dark. The whole edifice runs on one man's mastery of the warp, and the Emperor built a son whose potential in that same medium approached his own. You do not have to imagine the danger. Graham McNeill wrote it. In 1,000 Suns, Magnus sees the treachery of Horus coming and decides to warn his father the fastest way he knows, a psychic projection hurled across the galaxy from Prospero to Terra. And the force required to cross that distance shattered the wards Magnus did not even know were there. The secret webway project beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's hidden work, breached and broken by a single act of one son's power.
One Primarch, with one message, cracked open the most carefully guarded structure on Terra and let the things of the warp begin to pour through. He was later censured at the Council of Nicaea for sorcery, but Nicaea was the symptom. The disease was simpler. The Emperor had made a being who could break the Imperium's foundations by accident, out of love, trying to help. There is a detail in the way Magnus was made that matters here, and it is the reason a counter was not optional. Magnus was not dangerous because he was disloyal. For most of his existence, he was the most loyal son the Emperor had, the one who tried hardest to understand his father's hidden work, the one who broke the rules out of devotion rather than ambition. That is precisely what makes him the unsolvable problem. A traitor you can plan for. A traitor declares himself and you point your loyal sons at him. But a son whose loyalty itself becomes the doorway.
A son who tears open the wards trying to warn you cannot be defended against by loyalty, because the loyalty is the breach. The Emperor could not simply trust Magnus into safety. The thing that made Magnus dangerous was not a flaw in his character. It was the raw scale of what he was, and scale does not care about intentions. The warp pours through the largest opening it can find, and Magnus was the largest opening in the galaxy that wore a human face. Now ask the question the way an engineer would. The Emperor was, before anything else, the greatest mind humanity ever produced. He did not build 20 suns and hope. He built 20 instruments, each one a specific answer to a specific need in a plan that ran across millennia.
So if you are that mind, and you can see, as the Emperor of all people could see, a being who read probabilities the way the rest of us read a page, that one of your sons is going to grow into a psychic force you may not be able to contain, what do? You do not build a stronger psyker.
A stronger psyker is a bigger version of the same problem. He too can be turned, corrupted, broken, used as a door. Every solution that lives inside the warp is a solution that can be used against you from inside the warp. The Emperor had spent his existence learning that lesson the hard way. The warp does not have a bigger hammer. The warp has an off switch. And the only way to build an off switch for a thing made of warp is to build a thing that the warp cannot see at all. And this is where the record contradicts itself, or rather, where the record goes silent at the exact place the answer would be. Because the Imperium absolutely possesses that off switch.
It is a real, documented, canonical capability. It has a name. It is the blank. Let me be precise about what a blank is, because the whole thesis lives in this definition. Where a psyker generates a presence in the warp, a light, a signal, a soul that the immaterium can see, a blank generates an absence, a void where a soul should be. The lore calls them blanks, pariahs, untouchables, nulls. The words are interchangeable. They are immune to psychic powers. They are invisible to the warp. They are deeply, instinctively unsettling to be near, even for ordinary people who could never say why. And to a psyker, proximity to a strong blank is not unsettling. It is agony. The strongest of them, the omega-level nulls, can shut down psychic activity across an entire area and cause physical pain to anything psychic that comes close. A psyker's power simply stops working in a blank's presence. The light goes out. The Imperium does not merely tolerate this capability, it institutionalizes it.
There is an entire temple of the Officio Assassinorum built around it, the Corax temple. And the Corax assassin is the rarest assassin the Imperium produces, because the gene that makes a blank manifests perhaps once in a billion human births, or rarer. The Corax carries a device called the Animus Speculum, that fires bolts of negative psychic energy and grows stronger the closer it gets to a psyker, feeding on the very power it is meant to extinguish. Read that mechanism again because it is the whole thesis in miniature. The weapon is not a counter to the warp that stands apart from the warp. It is a weapon that turns the warp's own power against it, that drinks the light a psyker pours out and converts it into the bolt that ends him. The more power you bring, the more lethal the void becomes. There is no amount of psychic strength that makes you safer from a Corax. There is only more fuel.
The Corax exists for one job: to walk up to the most powerful psychic being in a room and switch it off. The Imperium built an assassin temple around the principle that the answer to overwhelming psychic power is not more power, it is the void. And every doctrine that large, that refined, that institutionally embedded came from somewhere. Capabilities like that are not invented in a generation. They are inherited, scaled down, made safe enough to deploy. Keep that in your pocket because we are going to come back to where the Imperium learned this. And here is where the audience asks the obvious question. The question this whole channel exists to chase. If the Imperium's doctrinal answer to a dangerous psyker is a blank, and the Emperor's most dangerous psyker was a Primarch, then what is the Primarch scale version of a blank?
One viewer put the thesis in a single line under another channel's video, and it gathered more than 200 likes because it is the cleanest statement of the idea anyone has managed. The 11th was the counter to Magnus, the source of the Pariah gene. That comment is the spine of everything we are doing. The proposition is that the 11th was not a failed son, not a mad one, not a casualty. He was the off switch. He was a blank scaled up to the size of a god, a Primarch who was a hole in the warp itself. But here we have to slow down and be honest, because the strongest version of this argument is the one that survives its own counter-evidence. The Pariah gene is not a blank canvas onto which we can paint anything we like. The lore gives it an origin, and the origin
is not a Primarch. According to Eldari sources and the savants of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Pariah gene was engineered into the human gene pool tens of millions of years ago, and the hand that engineered it was the Necrons. That is the on-page reading. The blank, in the deepest canon, is older than humanity's civilization, older than the Emperor, a thing seeded into our ancestors by a Xenos intelligence that wanted a weapon against the warp for its own ancient reasons. So when the theory says the gene had to come from the 11th, the canon answers back. It didn't have to come from anywhere new, because it was already in us. So what does that do to our thesis? It does not destroy it. It sharpens it. Because the existence of the gene in the population does not explain its concentration. A trait that appears once in a billion births, scattered, fragile, fatal in training more often than not. That is the gene at its natural dilution. The Emperor was a geneticist of a kind the galaxy had never seen. He took the raw material of humanity and concentrated it 20 times over into 20 demigods. If a sliver of the Pariah trait existed in the human line, and the canon says it did, then the being who could take that sliver and amplify it to Primarch scale, deliberately, was sitting on Terra in a gene vault, doing exactly that work. The Necron origin reading and the 11th reading are not enemies. One supplies the raw material, the other supplies the will and the laboratory. The Emperor did not need to invent the void. He needed only to find it in the blood and grow it into a son. And that is an inference. I want to be clear that it is an inference. The canon does not confirm it. But it is the inference the evidence keeps pointing at. There is even an eyewitness to the laboratory itself, and he is on the wrong side of history. In Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The First Heretic, the daemon Ingethel takes the word-bearers, Lorgar's sons, through a vision of the Emperor's gene vault, the place where the Primarchs were made. They are shown the project. They are shown the sons. And in the same book, Lorgar carries the knowledge that the Emperor ordered the 2nd and the 11th be forgotten. Not lost, ordered forgotten. A Primarch in canon, naming the erasure as his father's deliberate command. The gene vault was real. The work was real. And 2 of its products were marked for oblivion before the rest of the galaxy ever learned their numbers. Now we arrive at the part of the argument that most people skip, and skipping it is why most of these videos fall apart in the comments. If the 11th worked, if he really was a being who could nullify Primarch-scale power, then why bury him? You do not bury your best weapon. You point it at your enemy.
The answer is the most uncomfortable idea in this whole chain, and it is the reason the burial makes sense. Think about what a working anti-Primarch actually is. He is not a weapon you aim at Magnus and nothing else. A void does not discriminate. A being whose presence switches off psychic power switches off all of it. He is as lethal to the Emperor's psychic mastery as he is to Magnus's. He is a hole in the warp that does not care whose light it is standing next to. The Astronomicon itself, the beacon the whole Imperium navigates by, is a psychic phenomenon. A null of sufficient scale is a threat to the lighthouse. The Emperor built a sun to be the answer to one god, and in building him discovered he had built the answer to every god, including himself. A being who can switch off a Primarch can switch off a Primarch. There is no clause in that sentence that exempts the Emperor. There is a second edge to this, and it cuts toward the other Primarchs.
Imagine the rest of the Brotherhood learning what the 11th could do. 18 demigods, each of them a singular instrument of war, each of them in some sense irreplaceable, and one brother among them whose mere presence could unmake any of them, whose proximity could leave the proudest warrior in the galaxy reduced to an ordinary man at the worst possible moment. There is no version of the Great Crusade where that is a stable arrangement. The Primarchs were already a fractious, jealous, dangerous family even at the height of their unity. Introduce one whose gift is the negation of every other's, and you have not added a brother. You have added a loaded threat that sits at every table. The Emperor would have understood that the 11th was not only a danger to himself, he was a danger to the cohesion of the entire project, the single piece that, if widely known, could turn the Brotherhood's trust into terror overnight.
So the moment the 11th proved he worked, he stopped being a solution and became the single most dangerous entity the Emperor had ever made. Not because he was corrupt, not because he failed, but because of what he was capable of doing to the one man who could not afford to be switched off, and to every other son who could not afford to meet him. And one viewer caught exactly this implication, arguing the Emperor did not destroy him at all, that he hid him in stasis because he still needs him. Keep that thought, because it changes the texture of the whole crime. You do not put a failure in stasis. You discard a failure. You preserve an asset. The most damning reading is not that the 11th was thrown away. It is that he was filed, switched off, sealed, kept somewhere against a day when the galaxy might need a god that can unmake a god. We cannot confirm that. The records, as always, go quiet exactly where confirmation would live. But the logic of stasis is the logic of something too valuable to lose and too dangerous to keep awake. And there is a pattern here, an institutional habit that makes the whole thing read less like a one-time tragedy and more like a policy. Chris writes Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, is, at its core, about a cover-up. It is about Constantine Valdor, the first Captain General of the Custodes, and the quiet, total erasure of the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first generation of transhuman soldiers, dismantled and written out once they had served their purpose and become a liability. Terra erasing its own dangerous creations is not a theory. It is something the lore shows the Emperor doing, through Valdor, before the Primarchs were even loosed on the galaxy. The Thunder Warriors were the rehearsal. The 2nd and the 11th were the encore. When you have already watched the Imperium unperson an entire generation of its own warriors for the crime of being too dangerous to keep, the erasure of 2 Primarchs stops looking like an accident of lost records and starts looking like the same hand, doing the same thing, at a larger scale. Now follow the gene forward, because if the 11th was the concentrated void, the void did not vanish when he did. It got distributed. Look at what the Imperium has, 10,000 years later, and ask where the institutional knowledge of weaponized absence came from. The Colexis Temple, an entire assassin order founded on the Pariah gene, on the animus speculum, on the principle that you defeat psychic power with a void. The Sisters of Silence, the Anathema Psychana, an order of women who are every one of them blanks, recruited from untouchable stock, who hunt and cage and transport psykers across the galaxy, who crew the black ships, who walk into a room full of sorcery and make it go silent. And the Sisters of Silence are older than they look, which is the part that matters.
Their roots run back to the early Great Crusade, to the Somnus Citadel on Luna, to the very period when the Primarchs were being recovered and the Imperium was first learning how to handle psychic power at scale. Some accounts push their origin back further still, to a lost agency of the dark age of technology. Either way, the doctrine of the weaponized blank is present at the founding, woven into the Imperium's institutions at exactly the moment the Emperor's gene vault was producing its sons. The anti-psyker order and the Primarch project are contemporaries. They grew up together. And one of them, the Sisters, survived into the present fully documented, honored, deployed across 10,000 years. The other, the 11th, if the theory holds, was the concentrated Primarch scale version of the same principle, and he is the one thing from that period the Imperium will not name.
The institution endured. The individual was erased. That is exactly what you would expect if the individual was too powerful a version of a capability the institution was designed to keep safely diluted. The Imperium did not stumble into anti-psyker doctrine. It is built into the institutions, refined, deployed, doctrinal. The capability that the theory says was once concentrated in a single, erased sun is, in the present day, broken into safe and survivable pieces. An assassin here, a sisterhood there, a gene managed at the dilution of 1 in a billion so that no single bearer is ever powerful enough to threaten the throne. The weapon was not destroyed. It was disassembled into parts small enough to be useful and too small to be a god. And that is, again, an inference. The lore does not draw the line from the 11th to the Coalexis in so many words, but it is the shape the pieces make when you lay them out.
And there is one more thread worth pulling, because the record does give us a place where the 11th was, even if it will not tell us what happened there. That single clerical accident, the surviving line that places the 2nd and the 11th legions at the Rangdan Xenocides in the 860s of M30, is not nothing. The Rangdan Xenocides were the most terrible wars the young Imperium fought before the heresy. 3 campaigns against a Xenos threat from the galactic north, 2 solar decades of war out among the halo stars, whole expeditionary fleets lost without a single survivor, 19 inhabited systems laid waste, Titan legions obliterated, entire Space Marine legions said to be lost to the Imperium. The Lion's First Legion alone gave 50,000 of its own in the 3rd campaign to hold the Northern Imperium together. And somewhere in that furnace, the record says, were the 2nd and the 11th, and then the record says nothing at all.
We do not know if the 11th was deployed there as a test, as a weapon finally aimed at an enemy worthy of him, or whether the Rangdan War was simply the last place his number was written down before the censors reached it. The lore leaves it deliberately blank. But notice the shape of it. The 2 erased legions appear, for the only documented time, at the single most dangerous war of the age, and then they vanish from the page entirely. Whatever the 11th was, the Imperium's one surviving glimpse of him is at the edge of its worst nightmare. Make of that what you will. The canon refuses to make anything of it for you, and so will we. Which brings us to the objection. The single most common, most liked, most quoted counter to this entire thesis, and we are not going to dodge it, because dodging it is how you lose the people who actually know the lore.
The objection runs like this. He allowed his genocide to be tested, and it came back clean. Therefore, he is not one of the lost Primarchs. Therefore, the whole theory collapses. More than 300 people endorse that line, and on its face, it sounds fatal. If a Primarch's genocide reads clean, where is your monster? But look at what the objection assumes. It assumes the signature of a dangerous Primarch is corruption, a taint, a flaw, a readable wrongmiss in the gene. That is the right test for a Magnus, for a sun drifting toward the warp, because corruption is presence. It is something added. But a blank is the exact opposite kind of thing. A blank's entire nature is absence. He is not a soul with something wrong in it. He is the place a soul should be and isn't. So what would a blank's genocide read as? Not corrupted, not tainted. It would read as nothing unusual, because nothing unusual is precisely the signature of a void.
The absence is the result.
Clean is not the absence of the monster. For a being defined by absence, clean is what the monster looks like on the page. The test that exonerates a corrupted Primarch is exactly the test a Pariah Primarch would pass without effort, because there is nothing in him to find. The hole in the warp does not show up as a stain. It shows up as nothing at all. And now I have to do the thing this channel does that the others won't, which is tell you where the floor of the evidence actually is. That argument I just made is an inference. A clean, internally consistent inference, but an inference. Games Workshop has never officially named the 11th gene. It has never said the 11th was a blank. It has never confirmed the Pariah gene was concentrated in a Primarch. The on-page origin it does give points the other way, to the Necrons, to a thing seeded into humanity before there was an Imperium to seed it.
The Genocide-tested clean exchange itself lives in the conversation around these Primarchs, not in a sealed page of canon I can read back to you. So everything we have built tonight stands on two legs. One leg is solid documented canon. The erasure, the edict, the empty plinths, Magnus's sealing, the existence and doctrine of blanks, the Imperium's habit of unpersoning its own dangerous creations. The other leg is the inference that connects them, and the inference is ours, not Games Workshop's. We are not going to pretend otherwise. The strength of the theory is not that the canon confirms it. The strength is that the canon left a hole exactly the right shape, and refused, for 10,000 years, across every other mystery it has eventually answered, to fill this one in. So let's assemble it, and then let's stop, because the discipline of this is knowing where to stop. It was never hidden in a vault you couldn't reach. It was hidden in plain sight, distributed across the record, where no single piece looks like proof. A gap in a list of 20. 2 empty plinths a loyal Primarch walks past and understands. A temple of assassins built around a power with no origin the Imperium will name. A sisterhood of voids who do the work of switching off the warp every day as a matter of routine. A gene the Imperium uses constantly and explains never. A sun the canon refuses to name in a setting that has named everything else. Lay those pieces on the table and a picture stands up between them. The picture of a being engineered to be the answer to a god who worked and whose working was the reason he could never be allowed to be known. We are going to set the last brick down and leave it standing on its own without calling it canon, because it isn't. And the moment we call it canon, we become the thing we started by warning you about. The Emperor built 20 suns. 2 of them he unmade so thoroughly that the most powerful intelligences in the galaxy cannot agree they ever drew breath. We are told this was an accident of lost records. But you do not accidentally lose a god. You bury him. And you only bury the ones who worked. The 11th Primarch wasn't erased because he failed against Magnus. He was erased because he didn't. Because the Emperor built a son who could switch off a god, looked at what he had made, and decided the galaxy was safer, never knowing it was possible. It was hidden in plain sight. You just had to count.